No one wanted a widow with 5 children, until a broken cowboy took them in during the deadliest winter. The stagecoach driver wouldn't even look at her when he said the fare had doubled. Emma Hargrove stood in the frozen mud outside the station in Bitter Creek, Wyoming, watching her breath cloud the air while her youngest child coughed into her shoulder. She had $43 left to her name, and winter was already gnawing at the edges of November like a wolf testing a fence. "I can pay what we agreed in Denver," she said, keeping her voice level even though panic was starting to claw up her throat. "Ain't my problem, ma'am." The driver spat tobacco juice that steamed when it hit the ground. "Roads getting bad, snow's coming early this year, could get stuck out there for weeks." Behind her, the 4 older children huddled together on the platform. Mary, the eldest at 12, had her arms around the twins, Jacob and Samuel, who were 7. 10-year-old Ruth held baby Thomas, who was 2 and still burning with fever from whatever sickness had taken hold 3 days past. They looked like a line of tattered ghosts in their thin coats, and Emma felt the weight of every eye in Bitter Creek watching them, judging, calculating whether they'd survive. The town wasn't much more than a collection of weathered buildings squatting in the valley between 2 mountain ranges. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray threads. A few men stood outside the saloon, their faces hard and incurious. A woman in a burgundy dress pulled her shawl tighter and turned away when Emma met her gaze. No charity here. No sympathy for a widow who'd fled her dead husband's debts in Missouri with 5 children and a wagon that broke down 200 miles back. "Mama, I'm cold." Ruth's voice was small, nearly lost in the wind that swept down from the mountains, carrying the smell of coming snow. Emma pulled her own coat tighter, though it did little good. She'd already pawned her wedding ring in Cheyenne. The only thing of value left was her grandmother's cameo brooch pinned inside her dress, pressed against her heart. She couldn't sell that, wouldn't. It was the last thing that said she'd once been someone other than a desperate woman with impossible choices. "We'll figure something out, sweetheart," she said, and hated how hollow the words sounded. The station master stepped onto the platform, a portly man with wire spectacles that caught the weak afternoon light. "Mrs. Hargrove, I'm afraid if you can't pay the fare, you'll need to vacate the premises. We've got paying customers coming through." "I just need a day too." "Can't help you, try the church maybe. Reverend Hayes sometimes takes in strays." "Strays like they were dogs." Emma's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Arguing would get her nowhere. She gathered her children and their 2 battered carpet bags and walked down the platform steps, each footfall echoing in her chest. The street was a river of half-frozen mud. Thomas whimpered against Ruth's shoulder, and Emma reached over to press her palm against his forehead. Still hot, too hot. The church sat at the far end of town, a modest white building with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left. Emma pushed open the door, and the warmth inside felt like a miracle. Empty pews stretched toward an altar decorated with simple brass candlesticks. The smell of old wood and melted wax filled her nose. "Hello," her voice echoed in the quiet. A door behind the altar opened, and a thin man in a black coat emerged. Reverend Hayes had the look of someone who'd seen too much suffering and not enough grace. His face was lined with deep creases, and his eyes held the weariness of a man who tried to save souls in a place where survival took precedence over salvation. "Help you?" he asked, his tone neutral. "I'm Emma Hargrove. I was hoping you might know of work or somewhere my children and I could stay until." "Winter's here, Mrs. Hargrove." He said it like he was informing her the sky was blue. "Nobody's hiring. Most folks are trying to make it through themselves. I'd offer you a spot in the cellar, but it flooded last week and won't be dry till spring." "Please, my youngest is sick. I just need." "I can pray for you," he said, and she could see he meant it kindly, but prayers wouldn't feed her children or put a roof over their heads. She thanked him and left before the tears could start. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the first flakes of snow. They landed on her cheeks like cold kisses, melting instantly. Mary took her hand. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Emma looked down at her daughter's face, so young and already etched with worry no child should carry. "I don't know yet, baby, but we'll figure it out." They walked back toward the center of town, and Emma's mind raced through possibilities, each one collapsing under the weight of reality. She could try to find work as a laundress, a cook, anything, but who would watch the children? Who would hire a woman with 5 mouths to feed when there were men willing to work for less? The general store stood on the corner, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. Emma pushed through the door, the bell above jangling. Rows of goods lined the shelves, canned foods, bolts of fabric, tools, medicines. A man behind the counter looked up, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to guarded the moment he took in her ragged appearance and the children trailing behind her. "We are closing soon," he said. "I need medicine for fever, my son." "Got willow bark extract, $2. $2. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the coins in her pocket, counting them out carefully. $43 had to last until she found work, had to cover food and shelter and everything else. But Thomas needed medicine. She paid. The man wrapped the bottle in brown paper without meeting her eyes. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with another customer, a tall man in worn denims and a sheepskin coat dusted with snow. He stepped back quickly, his hand instinctively touching the brim of his hat in apology. "Sorry, ma'am." Emma looked up. The man was maybe 40, with a weathered face that spoke of years in the sun and wind. A scar ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline, pale against his tanned skin. But it was his eyes that caught her, dark and haunted, carrying a sadness so deep it seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stove. "My fault," she said, stepping aside. He nodded and moved past her toward the counter, but she felt his gaze follow her children as they filed out into the cold. Something in that look made her pause, not pity exactly, recognition, maybe, like he knew what it meant to carry burdens that never got lighter. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that clung to everything. Emma led her children to the overhang of the general store and gave Thomas his medicine. Tilting the bottle carefully to his lips, he swallowed and coughed, his small body shaking. "We need to find shelter," Mary said, her voice tight with fear. "I know." "The boarding house across the street," Ruth suggested, pointing to a 2-story building with a faded sign that read Sutton's. Emma had $39 left. She took a breath and crossed the street, snow soaking through her worn boots. The boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and old cigars. A heavy woman with gray hair pinned in a severe bun sat behind a desk, knitting. "Rooms are $3 a night," she said without looking up. "Cash in advance, no cooking in the rooms, no noise after 9. $3 a night. In 2 weeks, Emma would be broke. Is there anything cheaper, maybe something weekly?" "This ain't a charity house." The woman finally looked up, her eyes sweeping over Emma and the children with undisguised contempt. "And I don't take families with that many young ones, too much trouble. Please, just one night, my son is sick." "Not my concern, try the livery. Sometimes folks sleep in the hayloft if they're desperate enough." The word desperate hung in the air like a curse. Emma felt her face burn with humiliation, but she lifted her chin and walked out. Behind her, she heard the woman mutter something to another guest, and laughter followed them into the street. The livery stable sat at the edge of town, a large barn with a sagging roof. Emma pushed open the door, and the smell of horses and hay and manure washed over her. It was warmer inside, at least. A young man was mucking out a stall, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cold. "Help you," he called. "Could my children and I stay in the loft tonight? I can pay." He leaned on his pitchfork, considering, "I ain't supposed to let folks sleep up there, fire hazard. Please, just tonight, my son is sick and—" "Lady, I'm sorry, but the boss would have my hide. Try the church." "I did." He looked genuinely apologetic, but he shook his head. Emma turned to leave, her heart sinking. Where else could they go? The snow was coming down so hard now she could barely see across the street. They couldn't survive a night outside. Thomas wouldn't survive. She was standing in the doorway, paralyzed by indecision, when a voice spoke behind her. "I got room." Emma spun around. The man from the general store stood in the shadows near the back of the stable, leading a dappled gray horse. He met her eyes, and she saw that same haunted look, but beneath it was something else. Resolve, maybe, or loneliness so profound it had hardened into a kind of quiet desperation. "I'm sorry," Emma said. "I said I got room. My place is about 2 miles out. Ain't much, but it's dry and warm enough. You and your kids can stay till the storm passes." Emma stared at him. Every instinct screamed not to trust a strange man offering shelter. But what choice did she have? She looked at Thomas, his face flushed and damp, his breathing shallow. She looked at Mary's eyes, so full of fear and hope all tangled together. "Why would you help us?" she asked. The man was quiet for a moment, adjusting the saddle on his horse. "Because nobody helped me when I needed it," he said finally, "and I know what it's like to run out of options." His voice was rough, like gravel under wagon wheels, but there was honesty in it. Emma made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "All right, thank you, Mr. Calloway, Nate Calloway." "Emma Hargrove." He nodded. "Get your kids. We'll take the wagon out back, faster than walking." Nate's wagon was old but sturdy, the bed lined with straw. He lifted Thomas from Ruth's arms without asking and settled him in the back, then helped the other children up. Emma climbed onto the bench beside him, and he snapped the reins. The horse pulled them out into the storm, and the town disappeared behind a curtain of white. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the whisper of snow. Emma studied Nate from the corner of her eye. He sat hunched forward, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. There was something broken about him, something that matched the fractures inside herself. "You live alone?" she asked after a while. "I do now." The words held a weight that stopped her from asking more. The storm swallowed them whole, but Nate drove with the confidence of a man who knew every rut and rock of this road. Emma pulled her coat tighter and felt Thomas's fever burning against her back, where Ruth held him. 20 minutes later, a cabin materialized from the snow, low and solid, built from rough-cut logs, with a stone chimney sending smoke into the white sky. Nate pulled the wagon up to the porch and hopped down, then lifted each child out carefully. Emma followed, her legs stiff from the cold. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling behind an iron grate. A table and 4 mismatched chairs stood in the center of the room. Against the far wall was a bed covered with quilts, and beside it, a smaller cot. "You and the kids can take the bed," Nate said, already moving toward the fire. "I'll sleep out here." "Mr. Calloway, we can't." "You can." He didn't look at her. "I'll make some coffee. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry." Emma wanted to argue, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She settled the children on the bed, giving Thomas more medicine and pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. Mary helped the twins out of their wet coats, while Ruth curled up beside her little brother, her eyes already closing. When Emma finally joined Nate by the fire, he handed her a tin cup of coffee that steamed in her cold hands. She sipped it gratefully, the bitter heat spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what we would have done." Nate stared into the flames. "You'd have figured something out. People like us always do." "People like us." "People who don't got a choice." Emma studied his profile, the sharp lines of his face, the way his shoulders curved inward like he was protecting an old wound. "What happened to you, Mr. Calloway?" He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I had a family once, wife and a daughter. 5 years old she was." He paused, his throat working. "Fever took them both. Same winter storm like this one. I couldn't get to town for the doctor in time." Emma's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry." "Been 3 years. Sometimes feels like yesterday." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were raw. "Sometimes I can still hear my little girl laughing in this room. Drives me half crazy." "Why do you stay here then?" "Because leaving would mean forgetting, and I ain't ready to do that yet." Emma understood. She'd carried her own grief across half the country, the weight of a husband who died owing more than he'd ever earned. The shame of running from creditors, the fear that she was failing her children every single day. Some burdens you couldn't put down, you just learned to carry them differently. My husband died 8 months ago, she said quietly, left me with debts and 5 children and no way to pay for either. I've been running ever since. Nate nodded slowly. Ain't no shame in running when it's the only way to keep your kids alive. Doesn't feel that way. No, I suppose it don't. They sat in silence, and Emma felt something shift between them, not attraction exactly, but a recognition. 2 people who'd been broken by loss and were still somehow standing. There was a strange comfort in it. Over the next 3 days, the storm raged outside while the cabin became a small world unto itself. Nate was quiet, moving through his routines with the economy of a man used to solitude, but Emma noticed small kindnesses. He brought in extra firewood without being asked. He carved a whistle for Jacob and Samuel from a piece of pine. He let Mary help him feed the horses in the barn, teaching her how to brush their coats properly. Thomas's fever broke on the second night, and Emma cried with relief into her hands, her shoulders shaking. Nate didn't say anything, just handed her a handkerchief and then went back to carving by the fire, giving her privacy for her tears. On the third afternoon, the storm finally eased. Pale sunlight broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered valley into a field of diamonds. Emma stood on the porch, watching the light, and felt Nate step up beside her. "Road should be passable tomorrow," he said. Her heart sank. "I suppose we should head back to town then." "To what? That boarding house that won't take you, the Reverend with his flooded cellar." "I'll find something. Or you could stay here." Emma turned to him, startled. "Mr. Calloway." "Nate, and I ain't asking for anything improper, Mrs. Hargrove. I'm saying I got space, and winter's just starting. You need a place, and he trailed off, his jaw working. "I could use the help. Ranch work's been piling up. Someone to cook and tend the place. Your older girl could help with the horses. It'd be a fair trade." "People would talk." "Let 'em. Most folks in Bitter Creek don't come out this way anyhow." Emma's mind raced. It was improper, dangerous even. A widow and a widower living under the same roof with no marriage between them. The scandal would be tremendous if anyone found out. But what was propriety worth when her children were starving? "Until spring," she said finally, "then we'll reassess." Something like relief crossed Nate's face. Until spring. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. Emma cooked and cleaned, mended clothes, and taught the children their letters by lamplight. Mary took to the horses with a natural ease that made Nate smile, a rare expression that transformed his whole face. The twins helped gather eggs from the chickens Nate kept in a small coop behind the cabin. Ruth played with Thomas on the rug by the fire, building towers from wooden blocks Nate carved. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Emma and Nate began to orbit each other differently. It started with small things, a hand steadying her elbow when she slipped on ice, his eyes following her across the room when he thought she wasn't looking. She found herself laughing at something he said, a sound she'd almost forgotten she could make. He started talking more, sharing memories of his daughter that made Emma's heart ache for him. One night in late December, after the children were asleep, they sat by the fire sharing a bottle of whiskey Nate had been saving. The conversation drifted from small talk to deeper waters. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Emma asked, "starting over somewhere new?" Nate stared into his glass. "Every day, but this place is all I got left of them. Feels wrong to abandon it." "Is it wrong to want to be happy again?" He looked at her then, really looked, and Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I don't know if I remember how," he said quietly. "Me neither." The moment stretched between them, taut and fragile. Nate reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing against her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair. Emma didn't pull away. His touch was warm and rough and real, and she realized with a start that she'd been cold for so long she'd forgotten what warmth felt like. But before either of them could speak, Thomas cried out in his sleep, and the spell broke. Emma pulled her hand back and went to comfort her son, and when she returned, Nate had retreated to his cot, his back to the room. They didn't speak of it the next day or the day after, but something had changed. The air between them hummed with unspoken words. Emma caught herself watching him while he worked, the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the concentration on his face when he was mending tack. And she saw him watching her too, his expression unguarded in those stolen moments. It couldn't last. In early January, a rider came up the road, a woman on a bay mare, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Emma was hanging laundry on the line despite the cold when she saw her approach. Nate came out of the barn, his expression shifting from surprise to something darker when he recognized the visitor. Nate, the woman said, dismounting. She was handsome in a severe way, with dark hair shot through with grey and eyes like flint. Been a while. Margaret, his voice was flat. What are you doing here? Heard you got yourself some new houseguests. Thought I'd come see for myself. Her gaze slid to Emma, assessing. Margaret Calloway, Nate's sister-in-law. Emma's stomach dropped. Emma Hargrove. Hargrove, you the widow from town everyone's talking about. I suppose I am. Margaret dismounted and tied her horse, then walked right past Emma into the cabin without invitation. Nate followed, his jaw tight, and Emma trailed behind, her heart pounding. Inside, Margaret stood in the center of the room, taking in the children's things scattered about, Ruth's doll on the table, the twins' carved animals by the hearth, Emma's spare dress hanging on a peg. This is cozy, Margaret said, her tone acid. Real domestic. My sister's barely cold in the ground, and you've already replaced her. That's enough, Nate said, his voice low and dangerous. Is it? You think Sarah would want some stranger living in her house, sleeping in her bed, raising her? She stopped, her face crumpling for just a moment before she hardened again. You got no right, Nate. Your sister's been gone 3 years, Margaret, and this ain't your business. The hell it ain't. You're making a fool of yourself. And what about when spring comes and this woman takes off with whatever she can carry? What then? Emma felt her face burn. Mrs. Calloway, I assure you. I don't want your assurances. I want you gone. The children had emerged from the bedroom, their faces frightened. Mary stood in front of the twins protectively, and Ruth held Thomas tight. Emma's humiliation turned to anger. This is Nate's home, not yours, she said, her voice steady. If he wants us to leave, he can say so himself. Margaret turned to Nate, waiting. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Emma watched his face, saw the war being waged behind his eyes, grief and guilt, and something else, something that looked like hope. They're staying, he said finally. Margaret's expression hardened. Then you're a bigger fool than I thought. She strode to the door, then paused. Sarah loved you, Nate. Don't dishonor her memory by playing house with the first desperate woman who comes along. She left, and the slam of the door echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Nate stood motionless, his hands clenched at his sides. Emma wanted to go to him to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. She'd brought this down on him, her presence, her need, her children. Margaret was right. She was a stranger here, living in a dead woman's house. I'm sorry, she whispered. Nate didn't answer. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the snow, leaving Emma alone with her children and the ghosts that filled every corner of the cabin. That night, after the children were asleep, Emma sat by the dying fire and let herself cry. She'd been foolish to think this could work, foolish to let herself imagine that maybe, just maybe, she and Nate could build something from the wreckage of their old lives. Margaret's words had carved out the truth. She didn't belong here. She was a parasite, taking shelter in someone else's sorrow. The door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and snow. Nate stepped inside, his hair damp, his face raw from wind and something else. He looked at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. Don't, he said, don't apologize for being here. Don't apologize for surviving. Your sister-in-law is hurting, same as me, same as you. He crossed to her, dropping to his knees in front of her chair so their eyes were level. But she's wrong about you, about us. Nate, I've been dead inside for 3 years, Emma, just going through the motions, waiting for the day when I could follow Sarah and Lily into the ground. And then you showed up with those kids and all that fear and determination, and something woke up in me that I thought was gone forever." Emma's hands trembled. "I'm not her." "I know, and I ain't asking you to be." He reached up, his fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "I'm asking if maybe we could try being something new, not replacements for what we lost, just ourselves together." Emma closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her face. She'd been so afraid of wanting anything, of hopping for more than survival. But sitting here with this broken, honest man, she felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight band around her chest that had been there since the day her husband died. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too." She opened her eyes and found him watching her with such raw vulnerability that it took her breath away. Emma leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, their breath mingling in the space between them. "Until spring," she said. "We said until spring." "To hell with spring." His voice was rough. "Stay, not because you got nowhere else to go. Stay because you want to." Did she want to? Emma thought of her children sleeping peacefully in the next room, their bellies full for the first time in months. She thought of Mary's laughter when Nate taught her to rope a fence post. She thought of the way Thomas reached for Nate now, calling him Mr. Nate in his small voice. She thought of the warmth in this cabin and not just the fire. "Yes," she said, "I want to." Nate's breath released in a shudder, and then his arms were around her, pulling her close. Emma buried her face in his shoulder and held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to shake her loose. They stayed like that for a long time, two broken people finding shelter in each other while the snow fell outside and the fire burned down to embers. Spring came late that year, the snow not melting until April, but by then it didn't matter. Emma and Nate had already decided, not in words exactly, but in the quiet accumulation of shared moments. A ring appeared on her finger, simple and silver, placed there one morning after breakfast with the children as witnesses. No minister, no official ceremony, just a promise made in front of witnesses who mattered. Margaret never returned, but Emma heard she'd told the story all over Bitter Creek. The widow with 5 children and the broken cowboy who'd taken them in during the deadliest winter anyone could remember. Let them talk. Emma had learned that survival required a kind of courage that looked nothing like propriety. On the first warm day of May, Emma stood on the porch watching her children play in the greening field. Mary raced the twins toward the creek, their laughter floating on the wind. Ruth picked wildflowers while Thomas toddled behind her, his fever and weakness long forgotten. Nate came up behind Emma, his arms circling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. She leaned back into his warmth, solid and real. "You regret it?" he asked quietly, "staying?" Emma thought about everything they'd survived to get here, the cold, the hunger, the judgment, the ghosts. She thought about the way Nate's face had changed over these months, the haunted look fading as something like peace took its place. She thought about her children, thriving in ways she'd never imagined possible. "Not for a second," she said. Nate's arms tightened around her, and Emma watched the sun climb higher in the sky, burning away the last shadows of winter. They'd been broken when they found each other, she and Nate and all her children, scattered pieces that somehow fit together into something whole, not perfect, not without scars, but alive in a way that mattered. Behind them, the cabin stood solid against the mountains, smoke rising from the chimney into the clear spring air. Inside, 2 beds instead of 1. On the mantel, a photograph of Sarah and Lily beside Emma's grandmother's cameo, the past and present living side by side, honoring what was lost while making room for what remained. No one had wanted a widow with 5 children, but Nate Calloway hadn't been looking for what anyone else wanted. He'd been looking for a reason to keep breathing, and Emma had been looking for a place to land. They'd found both in each other. And that, Emma thought as her children's laughter filled the valley, was enough, more than enough. It was everything.